Welcome to episode 45 of Tahrir Podcast. It is the 20th of February, 2025. Today we have a special anniversary episode of the podcast for you. In February of 2021, the first episode of the Tahrir Podcast was posted. In the following 4 years, our host Nasef has posted 44 episodes featuring academics, activists, journalists, political analysts, and friends who have shared insights and knowledge on the Middle East. The podcast has engaged with and revived the legacy of the Arab Spring through conversations about Egyptian history and politics, but also through broad discussions with experts about geopolitics, social movements, censorship, and current events from Palestine to Syria, Ukraine, Sudan, the Gulf, Yemen, Lebanon, Iran, and more. There has been no stone left unturned. The podcast has traveled the world, carrying out interviews and giving talks in the Middle East, the United States, and Europe. The podcast has been ranked in the top 5% of podcasts globally and listed as one of the top 60 Middle East podcasts, racking out tens of thousands of views and listens on podcast platforms, YouTube, and social media. Tahrir Podcast is one of the few independent media sources in Egypt and the first explicitly political podcast to broadcast from Egypt. On top of these accomplishments, Nasef brought this project to life all on his own with a microphone and a computer in his room. In this interview, we're going to celebrate the 4-year anniversary of this project. We're going to flip the script and interview the host. We're going to learn about Nasef's journey building this podcast, what he's proud of and what he wants to improve going forward, and we'll get to know a little bit about the man behind the microphone. My name is Gabriel Gluskin-Braun. I am the research director for the Tahrir Podcast and your host today. Nasef, welcome to the Tahrir Podcast.
Thank you so much, Manuel. It sounds like a really fascinating project. I look forward to listening to it. Let me just open something first. Maybe it's going to show.
Woo! Brooke, congrats.
Thank you.
It's exciting. Yeah, I'll start off by saying congrats. Are you proud of the last couple years on this recording people talking into the void?
Man, that's a really big question. And it's also really difficult or weird to be talking about yourself, but I think on many levels I'm proud of the tenacity, of the consistency of it, of starting it in the first place, of the itself, of the progress and all. But I always think there's room for improvement. There's always room for more work. And there's this idea that's been haunting me for a while, really, and it's the fact that so far, and it's been 4 years, exactly 4 years today, since I started this project, and I haven't yet given it a couple of months of just, pouring all my energy and time in it. So far, it's been kind of a hobby, and even then, I think it reached a lot of exponential growth and progress, but still, I think there's a lot of potential that I still haven't tapped, and the plan for this year and the upcoming year, especially that starting April, I won't have a lot of responsibilities to take care of. So I think that will be prime opportunity to just focus on it and give it more time and more energy.
So some people might have been listeners from the first episode. Some people might have, just started with your last interview. Can you give people a little background on how you started the podcast and why? A little history, the lore of this project, and why we have this in the first place.
I think it's fairly simple. I think I just listen to a lot of podcasts on the Middle East in general, and that was before I started the podcast, the period I'm talking about. I still listen to a lot of podcasts right now on the Middle East, but before I started, I used to listen to a lot of them, and I noticed that there wasn't really many podcasts on the Middle East. There was maybe just 5, 10, 15 max, if you want to count the Middle East study centers and lectures and stuff online, sometimes in podcast form and so forth. So I would listen to them a lot, while cooking, while during COVID also a lot. I had a lot of time. And I think what made me think of starting this kind of project was the Tariq Masoud, Harvard's Middle East Initiative, which is kind of like a project where he would have decision makers, former diplomats, politicians, academics to basically talk about the Middle East through their views, and he would push them and have sort of engaging discussions with them, and they would then open it for questions and so forth. So I was really affected by it, in the sense that I thought, why not do something similar, especially that, as I said a couple minutes ago, there wasn't really there wasn't a lot of podcasts and projects like that. I mean, and I think this still is true even 4 years later. I think there still isn't a lot of podcasts on the Middle East or similar projects. And so I think one of the main inspirations is that series, the Middle East Initiative. But that's the part on the form and shape itself. But if you want to go back a little bit, I mean, of course, you can guess from the name, it's Tahrir Podcast, so it comes from Tahrir Square. So, of course, the Egyptian Revolution and the Arab Spring, which I evidently and observably am deeply and rooted affected by. And it is not really just these particular events per se, but the ideals behind them, which I think are fairly simple. And I think they are ideals that two sane people can't really, disagree on. The basic ideals of democracy, of respecting dignity, of freedom of information, freedom of expression, stuff like that. So it's not justice. So it's not really complex in terms of the very principles behind it. But I think that was the main, and that was also the jumpstart of it. I mean, the first episode that broadcasted this day 4 years ago was with a Swede that happened to be in Tahrir Square during the Egyptian Revolution. And the story of how that came about, I will tell it briefly. And then maybe it's not very, doesn't sound very interesting to listeners. So I was scrolling Facebook on the 10th anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution, and I found this album of pictures on Facebook. And there was this white guy in the middle of Tahrir Square, hanging out with protesters with their tents and so forth. And I thought, this guy must have really interesting stories, navigating checkpoints, all of that. And so I reached out to him and asked him, I told him, I've been thinking about starting this kind of project, and I think I would like to record the first episode of that with you. And he agreed, and we recorded a really good episode. And I mean, not the best episode, considering it was my first, and I was, still learning my way of asking questions, of writing things down. So it wasn't particularly the most professional, but I think ultimately it was an episode in which it was, or let me rephrase that, it was mainly like an episode for entertainment, documenting an oral history experience, just some kind of preservation of an experience, so that a century from now, a decade from now, someone could still go back to it and listen to it and, hear about the stuff that was going on during that time.
Yeah. And I was just to jump on that, like in your last interview with Rusha Latif, you said that to quote you, you said that the purpose of the podcast was to quote pile up all the knowledge and use it. So with like these interviews with people who are there in Tahrir and for combining that with academics or activists, journalists, how do you connect those threads of you're putting a lot of interviews together for posterity to show people you're saying 100 years from now, but it seems like there's like the practical side of using this knowledge and then also just recording it. So do you think that's accurate? Like it has that dual purpose? Do you see the podcast as an archive or also a guide to the present?
No, that's a really good question. I think it can be both simultaneously. I think it can be both an archive in terms of, as the time passes, many episodes become irrelevant. And here I'm referring more to the news and commentary kind of episodes and not the author book interviews. I think they stay relevant I think they stay forever relevant, but I'm talking about like in the current day, the present day, the relevancy can concede and can change, and that's when the archival kind of layer can come in. But for the author interviews, for example, I think it is also both simultaneously. If you want to read a certain book, you just listen to the episode and see if that kind of does it for you, or you need to read the book. And so I think it can be both simultaneously.
So talking about at the beginning of the podcast, how do you start getting guests? This first one you found on Facebook. But when did when you started reaching out to academics or journalists, like how did you just shooting your shot on Twitter DMs?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. Twitter, Instagram, email. But the first guest that I had, I think I reached out to her on Twitter, but I'm not particularly sure, to be honest, whether it was Holly McKay, the Australian American journalist, or Laura Kazanov. I actually forgot which one was the first, but anyway, one of them was the first author interview that I conducted, and I think the how I got into that and just shifted away from just documenting people's stories for like entertainment. I think it was because, I read a lot of literature on the Middle East and the Arab Spring and the Egyptian Revolution and so forth. And so I thought, and this is also when the Middle East Initiative project inspiration thing comes in. So I thought, why not reach out to these authors that I'm reading to? The real people, they're obviously going to be more than willing to talk about their work and make it more accessible. So that's when it came in. I started, and you'd be surprised really by the number of people that have turned down interviews. So it was just literally one or two individuals, and it's mostly over reasons that are understandable, security reasons, so forth. But most people, the overwhelming majority of people, are more than willing to come on the show and talk about their work and possibly have their work critiqued and discussed accordingly. And I think that's how it started, and I think it's going good.
So what is your advice for others who want to start a podcast, either on the Middle East or just anywhere in the world?
Well, I think the most important thing is to have a general idea of what you want to pursue. And the other really important thing, probably even more important than the topic, even though, of course, you need to have an idea of what you want to talk about, is to start as soon as possible. Because it's like a progressive learning type of thing. And the majority of stuff that I personally did learn and continue to implement has happened through trial and error. or not even trial and error, but you do stuff and then you realize how you could do it differently, how you could do it better. And this can happen. It can be technical, it can be non-technical. And so the only way I think you can really get better at it is to do it. So I think by starting, you just need a general idea, and then you start, and then everything else will follow and will fall in place accordingly. And so, yeah, just start, and everything is gonna fall into place after that. You gotta learn everything. Yeah.
And you've covered a lot of the different types of interviews and guests that we've had. What is a kind of coverage that you haven't explored yet, or that you want to do more of?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think I've covered really the majority of the Middle East, if not the whole Middle East. And if I would want to widen the scope, even though I have on multiple occasions, like the invasion of Ukraine, I had an interview on that and so forth, and even one in Bangladesh when they had their uprising a couple of months ago, and even recorded an episode with the journalist there after the internet was resumed, because they cut off the internet there during their uprising. But I had to kill that interview for some technical reasons, and also because the situation kept developing on the ground, so I was not really sure whether the interview would remain relevant for a long time. So I chose to kind of wait it out, and maybe I could pick it up soon. But to answer your question, yeah, I think covering major global events, if something, happens in Asia, something notable happens in Africa, something notable happens in Europe, Latin America, of course, I'd be more than willing to cover something like that. And I should actually work on having kind of a more not universal. I think the main focus should be and will remain on the Middle East. But if something arises, as I said, I think I should put more effort into covering it as well. And this also extends to books. So author interviews, I should also make the book selection more diverse. So it's not just the Middle East. Of course, predominantly Middle Eastern, but it should be also more general as well.
Looking back on the first few years of the podcast, would you do anything differently? Would you change anything with how you got your guests, or what topics you covered, or how you built the podcast?
Yeah, I think there are many things that I would have done differently, but I think the one that comes to mind right now is the fact that it has always been kind of like a hobby, something that I'm doing on the side, not something that I was 100% in. I mean, obviously, of course, I think about it always. I'm always planning episodes. I'm always reading and preparing for episodes, year round. So I wouldn't change anything about that in particular, but I think what I would change is that I would give the podcast more time. And if there was a particular episode that I think I could have done differently, it would have been the one with Sharon Grewal, author of Soldiers of Democracy, Military Legacies in the Arab Spring. I think that was a really good book, and one that I still often think about. And the arguments in that book I find extremely well made. And the thing is, when I recorded this episode with Grewal, I haven't recorded in months, so I was a little rusty, so the episode turned out to be pretty short, and I didn't ask a lot of questions. There were some thoughts I didn't share, and I attribute that to just, being rusty, not having recorded in a while, so it just felt like I was relearning the whole process again. And I actually plan on re-recording that particular episode, because, these kinds of episodes are, the author interviews, they're not something that becomes irrelevant, because it will always be relevant for the book, and the people that are interested in reading this book, or books in particular, And so I think it's important to leave behind something that can remain relevant for forever. I don't want to be exaggerating, but to be relevant for a very long time.
Yeah. And so one episode that you want to redo, but what are a couple episodes that were really impactful, some episodes that like stand out and that were meaningful and you felt like were some of the top podcasts that you did over the last couple of years?
That's a really good question. I think it's pretty hard to kind of classify them, but I think I think maybe the first episode I recorded in person, and it was with Aaron Salzberg, and we discussed the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And what was really interesting about this episode, of course, besides it being in person in his office in North Carolina, was the fact that he was part of the 2015 agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan. And he was part of a negotiation team, part of the U.S. State Department. He was the first special coordinator for water at the U.S. State. And what I found extremely insightful about this particular episode is that he was not only a diplomat that was involved in negotiations, but he was also a water expert. So he really knew both the science of it and the diplomacy and the effort that went into these negotiations. I mean, when they were going on, but so far negotiations have failed. But I think that was particularly insightful, especially that I don't think there has been any interviews that have covered both the diplomatic layer of it and also the technical aspect of it. So I think this episode is extremely valuable. I recorded in 2023 in February 1st. And maybe another episode that was also particularly impactful, I believe, was episode 25. And that was the one I recorded right after the Aaron Salzberg episode. And episode 25 was the second in-person episode, and it was with Egyptian historian Khalid Fahmy. And we recorded this episode in Arabic. And we recorded it in person as well in Massachusetts at Harvard, at the Science Cabot Library. And we covered a wide array of topics in that particular episode. We spoke about historical counter-narratives. We spoke about the archives, about censorship, about political defeat, revolutionary defeat, about democracy, about the Egyptian revolution. And actually, this is the most listened to episode on all platforms so far in the history of the podcast. I think it's more than 20 or 30,000 just for this episode alone. And maybe another also notable episode was also the following one, episode 26 with Cameron Hudson. And it was on the war in Sudan. And that was in May 2023. So it was just a couple of weeks after the war in Sudan had started. And we also met in person in Durham, North Carolina. We met at a studio there, which turned out to be like a local rapper hotspot. And the studio smelled like weed. So it was quite a little bit embarrassing, meet someone who used to work in the White House. And maybe another episode that was also interesting, I think the coverage for the presidential election, the Egyptian presidential election 2023, 2024, I think that was what really kind of put the podcast on the map in terms of commentary and coverage and reporting and analysis on Egyptian affairs. But also, it did not start with the election, the analysis part and the Egyptian politics part. It started in 2022, actually, on the Egyptian National Dialogue. It was episode 21. And in that episode, I kind of I kind of predicted. I'm not sure if predict is the correct word, because it's not like I'm seeing the future, but I thought that the national dialogue that was proposed in 2022 about like reconciliation, and that I thought it was going to be bullshit, and it turned out to have been bullshit. And that episode, I particularly argued that this is unlikely, really, to address the root causes of political repression and control in Egypt, because the problem is not really it's not constitutional. I mean, of course, there are aspects that are constitutional, but the core issue, which I discussed, is the court that processes these prisoners of conscience, of like political prisoners. And so I argued that in order to have political reconciliation and so forth, you need to address the root cause, not just form new committees, form new things along those lines. You have to address the root thing, and that still didn't happen until this day. They never addressed it, and I brought it up repeatedly on this episode. It was actually the main talking point. Maybe another one. There's also the episode 32, the one episode 32, the one I recorded from Gaza live. I mean, I wasn't there. The journalist was there, and there was a communications blackout in Gaza when we recorded it, and nothing was coming out of the strip. All communication towers have been bombed, and everything was cut off, and nothing really was coming out. But I managed to reach this journalist, Hind Khudari, and we managed to record an episode on WhatsApp because the connection she had was very weak. It was an eSIM, and so we couldn't speak directly. So I sent her my questions, and she replied in voice notes, and then I recorded my part, and then I put it together and published it. And this particular episode actually was translated into Swedish and published in a magazine, the transcript of it, and also was cited in a Vox article because of how scarce stuff was coming out of Gaza during this period. It was, I believe, late October 2023. And and maybe something notable, that was recorded very recently, was episode 43, which was also in Arabic, even though most episodes are in English, but this particular episode was in Arabic, and we discussed, I had the Syrian author and journalist, and no, he was not a journalist. I had Jabir Bakr, a Syrian author and filmmaker and former political prisoner, and he co-authored a book called The Syrian Gulag, Assad's prison system from 1970 to 2020. And the book kind of covered really Syria's whole prison apparatus, its intelligence agencies, how political prisoners are processed, how the process looks like, the types of different prisons that Syria had, the methods of torture. We really went into the very specifics of it, and I think he was very eloquent. He made really good points, very good arguments, and he also broke down everything that was covered in the book, even though the book was quite encyclopedic when it came to understanding how the Assad regime functioned in Syria. But I think most episodes are generally very valuable, but these are the ones that really come to mind right now.
And the Assad regime fell a week after the podcast.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think about it, because when we were discussing it, we were talking about stuff that was happening in real time, stuff that never stopped. But a week after, it was historical. It was history that we were talking about. It was stuff that was no longer taking place. And so I was very happy.
You obviously, there's struggles that you have with producing this media, independent media by yourself, but you also seem to be able to do things that other media outlets don't. So where do you think you get this advantage from, and how do you find these voices and stories and perspectives that aren't very often shared in the regular media world?
Well, I think the main thing is that there is no hierarchy. There is not a lot of people involved. It's just me, and until very recently, it was just me. And then you started helping me out, and then you became the director of research, and then started helping me even more. So, but before that, it was just me. So that made it much easier. And even now that you're part of the team, it's still very easy because we're just two people, and we discuss, we share thoughts, we have conversations. You know, there's no corporation or someone who's, I mean, we're doing this for free. So really, there's no one has any leverage really over the type of work that we do. And I think this is both an advantage and a disadvantage because it kind of course, factors into the amount of work that you put in. And I don't mean work as in the quality of it, but I mean the quantity and the frequency. In the sense that it is a very personal and a very intimate project, and one that I wouldn't really regret putting a lot of time in, but I think it remains also liberating, the fact that this is not something that you're doing for a living. You're really doing it because it's you're passionate about it, you think it's important, and so forth. Despite the risks as well. I mean, all of this is fair grounds for political persecution. People have had their lives ruined over much, much, much less activities. But I don't want to sound dramatic, but I remain determined and undeterred. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken the decision to start such a project 4 years ago.
So you've brought on all these guests who have written books and carried out interesting journalistic projects. So what project would you take on? What book or story would you write?
I think it's very hard to answer that question, especially because my interests are very widely. And so there isn't really a particular topic that I would like to investigate. But maybe one thing that comes to mind right now, and it's something that I've thought about before a couple of times, and it's the intertwining or the relationship between media and the formation of opinion, and how your media diet and your environment maybe just your media diet kind of dictates the sort of political opinion that you hold, or the political opinion that you express, or even the values or ideologies that you acquire. I think this is a very interesting topic to study, and it is probably one that is widely researched, but I think it remains interesting and relevant, whether for Egypt or for the Middle East or for the globe in general. Especially now that media and digital media kind of overtaking the new forms of media that have developed and arisen as the internet kind of took the world made it into every house and so forth. So these kind of things are changing. So it's no longer a TV that you can just control the sort of things that are broadcast on, but rather I think it remains the same thing. It's just that the battlefield is now open. So it's not as easy to control, but it's also never been easier to control, really, if you think about it. Especially that it doesn't really take you a lot of resources or effort to kind of start something from the ground up. Kind of like if you want to start an independent media organization, you can just get some resources and you can build one. And it shouldn't necessarily be independent. I mean, let me rephrase that. I don't want to overcomplicate it. But I think the extent to which one can manipulate news or start some kind of a news organization that can be manipulative, even if it's just an online page, like a page on Twitter, for example, not something that even has a website or anything of that sort. I don't think it's been easier for this kind of thing to spring up. And this, of course, obviously can bring both advantages and disadvantages. And the advantages that it brings is that, I mean, the podcast is kind of like that. It's an independent project started from the ground up. And the advantages are you have more freedom, you have more reach, you have more influence, you're independent, you're doing real work. And the disadvantages could be that you could spread disinformation. But this is also not exclusive of similar independent projects. I mean, big media corporations can also corroborate and start and spread disinformation. So I wouldn't call it really a defining feature. But that's the part I was just elaborating on. The ease with which one can manipulate the news and spread disinformation. This risk also increased rapidly, almost in tandem. But I think but I don't find it to be a defining feature of such projects.
And also, when we think about the Arab Spring, I think a lot of what people talk about is a lot of online activity, a lot of people talking about things in a space where they couldn't before. But also, do you feel like in the last 10 years, talking about how today, the last 10 to 15 years, today you can start independent media, and there are some risks to that. But is there still that potential for, really revolutionary, radical stuff to happen on the internet, or is it just another place where the state can control or punish for a certain level of discussion that's too far?
Of course, but also let me just re-add this point to my previous answer, is that what I was talking about was not particularly for Egypt. I was talking about the global scene. But to answer your last question, sure. I think it is I think it is obviously much easier to repress it now that it exists, because the such independent platforms were not a thing even in the early 2000s, and like 2010, 2011, there wasn't really anything even remotely similar. There was a lot of blogs, a lot of things like that, which I think, that can also qualify as independent sort of media platform, because you have your own platform and so forth. But in terms of repression, I mean, Mada Masr, an independent Egyptian news and investigative website, it's blocked in Egypt. So it's very much easy to also, as easy as it is to start similar projects, and I don't view it as easy, it's also never been easier to just block it off. And it's also even easier to overcome that blocking. You can just download a VPN and it's over. But the thing is, and specifically on that part, the VPN part, and how easy it is to circumvent that, is that I don't think the vast majority of people really know that overcoming online censorship is pretty easy and simple. But then again, I think this brings out other topics to light. And one of them is the fact that such platforms like Mada Masr, for example, or Al Manassa, which are really good, the platform, is the fact that I don't think they have many readers. I don't think it exceeds 1 million, for example, both of them combined. And so...
And especially domestically.
Of course, yeah. How many people you think read them? Maybe 100,000, a 250,000, which I think is also an overestimation. And the thing is, it has to do with the very nature of these platforms, because how would an average guy come across these kinds of media if only by coincidence? I don't really see a scenario in which some guy living in Upper Egypt or the Delta or something that has very limited access to the internet really comes across any of these platforms. And even then, and I'm not speaking, of course, in specific about these two particular platforms. I'm talking about like independent journalism platforms in general in Egypt, which is also brings us to, I know I'm jumping from topic to another, but I think it's all related, is the fact that there isn't really a lot of independent media platforms in Egypt. It's just Mada Masr Al Manassa. There was an Arabic website called Al-Hurriya, Freedom. They do also really good work. There's another platform called Fikr Tani, or Fakkar Tani, Think Again. And add to that maybe 3 more or 2 more, and then the podcast, and maybe another also similar project, and that's it. That's the independent media landscape. And this goes without saying, but it is ultimately the atmosphere that imposes and dictates that. Had journalism not become de facto illegal, this wouldn't be the predicament we find ourselves in. And as someone who does real work, I, for the past 4 years, have felt like a serial killer waiting to get caught. Only that I never murdered anyone. I just provide and do honest work, and work that I believe in and behind which I stand firmly. And if you think about it, it is ultimately me engaging with the literature that I already consume and engage with on an intellectual level, and only just giving it a platform, and not only giving it a platform and also making it more accessible on a global scale, not just for Arabic speakers, given that there are subtitles, but also for people from all over. You only need an internet connection to be able to listen to these sorts of conversations and interviews. And besides that, then there is the commentary and analysis on Egyptian affairs and Egyptian politics. And I think this is kind of where the niche of the podcast comes in. I mean, the author interviews, this is not something exclusive or something rare. I mean, in a sense it is, but generally it is not. But it's the Egyptian politics part that really kind of puts the podcast in a place where not many people are.
Everything else, 100 million people.
Yeah, everything else is either controlled by the state directly or indirectly, or was relatively independent but has been co-opted, or it's foreign. So like the New York Times, Reuters, AP, France 24. And I don't think their work is bad either. I think it's valuable, but I was specifically talking about independent Egyptian platforms. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. And then I think you mentioned this before about how sometimes people who are trying to say or trying to critique end up being in this sphere outside of that, kind of becomes disconnected from the actual, the life on the ground, people on the ground, people who are like, living in Egypt and, whose actual lives are there. And so people who either live in the West or outside the country, or even these independent media sources who struggle to connect with a broad segment of the population, there becomes this cycle where they're producing stuff, they're producing material and producing knowledge, not for the country itself or not for the people itself. It becomes kind of like it becomes disconnected from the what's actually going on. Is that kind of one of the main challenges of independent media in general, but also specifically in Egypt, of if there's this censorship and this, you're kind of pushed to the fringe inside Egypt, then your actual audience becomes stops being the people that you're trying to target. It stops being the people that you're trying to reach.
I'm not really sure if that's the main challenge. I think the main challenge is the repercussions that you potentially face, if you haven't yet faced them. I think that's really the most important hurdle, I think. And the part about the audience, I mean, as an independent news website, I'm not really sure what you could do to try to reach more people. I mean, you can of course be proactive, you can market yourself more, you can invest more in marketing your platform and so forth. But then again, I think maybe not everyone is really interested in doing that. Maybe they just want their reach to be not as wide. Although, I mean, I don't know. I've never really worked in any of these platforms, or I mean, I've met people that work there, but we never really discussed that particular topic. But then again, this also brings to question the idea that the question that how many people really do read news online? I mean, check news websites. Because when you bring that question, you almost by default are arguing that people are reading other sites anyway. But the thing is, it's not that they're not reading these independent websites or platforms per se. It's that they're not checking stuff like that to begin with, which I think is another topic of discussion. But I think the main issue, or of course the number one problem for independent media and real journalism in Egypt, and for any kind of journalism really, is censorship. And that could be either by blocking their website or raiding their office and arresting and harassing and blackmailing and all of that. So I think this is really the most important, the biggest hurdle, really. And also, yeah, let me add that. And as you're kind of defining that by continuing to work regardless, you are also by default keeping your grounding yourself. And by grounding yourself and continuing to produce, the likelihood that people are going to come across your work increases. And so I think this is that's how they both are kind of intertwined.
What was your Europe tour like? How was the experience in bringing the podcast on the road and interacting with students and professors and sharing the podcast with a new audience in person?
Yeah, so that was particularly interesting. So around November 2024, I was invited by multiple European universities, the Free University of Berlin, Sciences Po Strasbourg, the University of Strasbourg, and Malmo University to deliver a series of lectures on independent media and Tahrir Podcast in light of the current landscape in Egypt, and by default break down Egyptian politics and delve deeper into some of the topics that were discussed. It was very interactive. The questions the students and the professors asked and the conversations we had were very enjoyable and very insightful. And overall, I think it was a very productive and engaging trip. And I also felt very passionate about it. I mean, it was my first kind of like public talk or lecture. I mean, I'd spoken about the podcast, of course, before in a class at my alma mater, but I think it was different because, you're in a different place, you're in a completely different environment. And also one of the lectures that I gave was in Arabic, actually. And I think overall, I think it was a really good experience, although it was really cold, super cold, but I think it made it worth it to engage with the students and then the professors. And I also want to take this chance to thank them for their hospitality, their generosity, and for their time. It was absolutely beautiful, and I look forward to doing more speaking engagements, be it in person or online. And I'd also like to take this chance to thank each and every listener of the podcast, the ones that have been listening from the start, the ones that have started listening as of recently, the ones that this is their introduction to the podcast. I thank you very much for supporting an independent project. You are the sole reason that this project is ongoing, that you continue to listen, that you continue to engage, that you continue to be critical, that you continue to reach out and contribute to the conversation. All of that keeps the podcast up and running. If you feel like you could contribute to the podcast financially, you can subscribe on Patreon for as low as $2 a month, and that helps greatly. And thank you so much for the past 4 years. It has honestly been a pleasure and an absolute honor. And I aim to continue doing that. And I aim to continue walking down that path, for I believe it is righteous and necessary. I hope this doesn't sound very dramatic.
كسر بطاقة الهوية الحزب أدينا رافض دولجية المدير رفض أجور إضافية الصحفي كسب جايزة إعلامية المهرج رقص ألوان الوطنية المشروع القومي تسهيل النقدية الأشول عسكري خطواته يمينية مغفل بيرضع بزاز ديمقراطية الأمم متحدة ضد العنصرية للقنابل وجهة شرق أوسطية النسر ختم لي بهجرة غير شرعية الوزير زور بطاقة علاجية الموظف سرق وزارة المالية والسياسي يا عيني عالسياسي شاعر قهاوي راكع تحت السيدو يشكن يكيف يرميله جنيه في ايده سادتي أعزائي المجنونة صدق على حكم القاضي الكمينة بيحلل بول للتعاطي والملك كرشه من جيب النباتي الوكيلة رفض طالب في الإعدادي الوزارة خلفت جيل إنسان آلي تعابين أكلت بيوتها من مكانها أرانب هربت وشوهين عيالها الأعور قدم طلب للتعافي القاضي واخد أجازة السنادي المريض بريل حرب حكم سيادي البنك بيغسل فلوس الحرامي الكسب مشروع مكتب الرشاوي والسياسي يا عيني عالسياسي حبة فوق وحبة تحت